It's been over a year since Cuba and the United States announced the renewal of diplomatic ties. On the eve of a U.S. presidential visit to the island nation, how have things changed? I'm Elaine Reyes in Washington, D.C., and this is a special edition of America's Now.
I'm Michael Voss in Havana.
Barack Obama is supposed to meet with Raul Castro. They've seen each other a few times now. So what can we expect this time?
This time, they've got to look to the future. It's more complicated.
Why did President Obama wait so long?
It's also a matter of building confidence with the Cuban government.
Well, Barack Obama's visit to Argentina is perhaps not as historic as his visit to Cuba, but just as in Havana, the meetings that take place in Buenos Aires will have a major bearing on the future North-South relations in the Americas. Argentina and the United States have had something of a fractious relationship over the past decade. It will nonetheless look to change the relationship between the region's third largest economy, Argentina, and its northern neighbor.
Welcome to the show. The last time a sitting president from the United States visited Cuba was back in 1928. That changes this week when President Barack Obama becomes the first U.S. president to travel to Cuba in more than 80 years. The historic trip follows a series of diplomatic announcements after the leaders of both countries declared the reestablishment of relations at the end of 2014. So where do things stand now? Joining me from Havana is our correspondent, Michael Voss. Michael, welcome to the show.
Always a pleasure to join you on America's Now, Elaine.
Barack Obama is supposed to meet with Raul Castro. They've seen each other a few times now at various events. So what can we expect this time? Many eyes will be watching as President Castro plays host.
Elaine, hundreds of journalists have flown in to witness this historic event. We're also expecting huge crowds of Cubans to turn out to see President Barack Obama. He's very popular amongst ordinary Cubans here. We expect he will receive a very warm welcome. But I think at a political level, it becomes more complicated. After 50 years of hostility, there is still a lot of mistrust and a lot of big differences, be it the continuing U.S. trade embargo or U.S. pressure on human rights and democracy. I think one of the really interesting things to look out for will be the body language when the two leaders meet, Barack Obama and Cuba's leader, Raul Castro. As you mentioned, Elaine, they have met before. There was the famous handshakes and meeting at the regional summit in Panama. At that point, they were surrounded by other leaders of Latin America who thoroughly approved of this normalizing of relations between the two countries. It was a very warm meeting. This time, they've got to look to the future. It's more complicated. So the question is, will they be able to seize the initiative and really turn this into a historic game changer, a bit like the visit by former U.S. President Richard Nixon to China?
Michael, you've lived in Cuba for quite some time now. Describe what you have witnessed over the past year. How would you describe the mood between Cuba and the United States? Would you consider it friendly?
Yes, it is. Certainly at a street level, Cubans are really happy, really pleased that this relationship is finally, this hostile relationship has finally come to an end, and they're looking forward to what sort of economic progress and benefits it will bring. The biggest change we've seen on the streets in the last year is the huge number of American visitors who are now coming to Cuba. 160,000 last year, a jump of 80% compared to 2014. Hotels have doubled their prices. It's still very difficult to get a room. It's been great news for Cuba's private sector. Those Cubans who've opened quality private restaurants for tourists. People have opened their homes for bed and breakfast, which you can now book on Airbnb. And all those Cubans who own those classic American cars and take tourists around Havana on day trips. We've seen more internet. There are Wi-Fi hotspots all over the country. And now that President Obama has dropped restrictions on how much money Cuban Americans can send to relatives, we're seeing a lot more Cubans opening up businesses and also doing up their homes. There's lots of activity going on at that level. But on the other side, for anyone who's not connected to the tourist industry and who doesn't have a relative abroad, times remain tough. The economy has not improved, their lives have not changed. Thousands are trying to reach the United States, but there is still a feeling here that this new improved relations should help improve people's economic lives. Elaine, as you know, the announcement to restore relations took the Americas and the world by surprise. It came 50 years after both countries had broken off diplomatic ties. Let's take a look at some of the key events that led to this stunning, historic shift. 1959, Havana has fallen. Fidel Castro celebrates the victory of the revolution. A US-funded radio station started broadcasting false rumors of a new law that would take children away from their parents and send them to military camps or even the Soviet Union.
Y los mensajes que transmitían eran: madre cubana, salva a tu hijo, ve a la iglesia, no permitas que te lo quiten, el gobierno cubano te dejará sin tus hijos, no podrás verlo más.
More than 14,000 Cuban children were airlifted from Havana to Miami. In April 1961, Cuba's scenic beaches turned into battlefields when warships filled with US-backed Cuban exiles launched a bid to overthrow the Castro government. It was the Bay of Pigs invasion, a historic event that this museum commemorates, detailing how the CIA-trained force came to invade the island nation.
Se empiezan a reclutar en Opa-locka, la Florida. Se entrenan en Guatemala, pasan por Honduras y salen de Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua.
At the time, Cuba's ties to the Soviet Union were considered a threat to the United States, and Fidel Castro's brand new government had nationalized US-owned businesses and property, further angering their neighbors to the north. The Bay of Pigs was set out by the CIA during President Eisenhower's term and put into action by John F. Kennedy. Cuban veterans remember vividly the battle that followed. The invasion failed. Fidel's army claimed victory within 72 hours. 1,200 prisoners would later be handed back to the US in exchange for $53 million worth of medical supplies and food. A year later, at the peak of the Cold War, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev persuaded Fidel Castro to install nuclear missiles on Cuba to even the power balance. Castro agreed, but the missiles were spotted by US spy planes before they could become operational.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The US implemented an island quarantine to search vessels headed to Cuba. Castro urged Khrushchev to threaten a nuclear strike on the US should Cuba be attacked. But Khrushchev was desperate to avoid a nuclear war.
Or escalated, and
he spoke with Tom Putnam, director of the Kennedy Library.
John F. Kennedy, really the hallmark is that he put himself in Khrushchev's shoes. He tried to think, what can I do, what can we do to resolve this, to help him save face. Again, he showed steady resolve. He wasn't going to give in, but he found a way to both be resolute, but also find a way to defuse the crisis.
Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US commitment not to invade Cuba and an understanding that the US would remove their nuclear weapons from Turkey. To this day, many Cubans maintain that missiles were there only for self-defense.
La culpa fundamental recae en el gobierno de Estados Unidos, desde la administración de Eisenhower con la administración Kennedy, la culpa, porque
In the late 1970s, the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger ordered a series of secret contingency plans that included airstrikes and mining of Cuban harbors in the aftermath of Fidel Castro's decision to send Cuban forces to Angola, according to declassified documents. If we decide to use military power, it must succeed. There should be no halfway measures. Kissinger instructed General George Brown of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during a high-level meeting of national security officials. There was also Operation Mongoose, a long-running covert CIA operation aimed at sabotaging the Cuban economy and assassinating Fidel Castro. There were dozens of attempts, ranging from poison pills to toxic cigars and exploding mollusks. The Cuban civilian airliner was also blown up mid-air in 1976, killing all 73 people on board. The man accused of complicity in that attack, Posada Carriles, still lives openly in Miami. In 1980, amid growing tensions at home, Castro said that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so. It provoked a mass exodus from the port of Mariel. As many as 125,000 Cubans made the journey to Florida. Castro also emptied jails and mental health facilities to join the Mariel boat lift, effectively ending attempts by US President Jimmy Carter to mend relations with Cuba.
They got the boy.
Another major crisis came during the Clinton administration, involving the fate of a 5-year-old Cuban boy, Elian Gonzalez. His mother drowned in 1999 while attempting to flee Cuba to the United States, and a custody battle ensued. According to Vicky Huddleston, a former US official in Havana, this was a turning point.
Clinton, before Elian was ready to begin opening up. Then you have Elian, and it's almost like, well, did Fidel really want the Elian crisis? Because he knew Clinton was trying to open up at that time.
After the Soviet Union collapsed, their sugar-for-oil deal with Cuba ended, forcing the island into a severe economic crisis with widespread hunger and deprivation. That only started to ease after Cuba found a new economic ally and benefactor, with the election almost a decade later of Hugo Chavez in oil-rich Venezuela. But today, Venezuela's economy is itself in crisis. According to Georgetown professor Eric Langer, the Cubans are aware that this support may not last much longer.
The big guy in the bloc and the one who has really supported Cuba over the last 10 years or so has been Venezuela. And now it was quite clear to the Cubans that that couldn't keep up.
This may be one of the reasons why in December 2014, Cuba's President Raul Castro made the historic joint announcement with US President Barack Obama to restore diplomatic relations.
This is a huge deal. This is really the biggest thing since 1961, or perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was only a year later. And so this really, I think, can change not just U.S.-Cuban relations, but will change U.S. presidential politics, and it will also change the relationships between the United States and Latin America, which, as you know, have been going downhill.
With the flag-raising ceremony outside the Cuban embassy in Washington on July the 20th, both countries have reopened their embassies for the first time in 54 years. One of the last vestiges of the Cold War is finally coming to an end. But after more than half a century of conflict, there is still a lot of mistrust to overcome. Restoring diplomatic relations is just the first step on a long, hard road towards normal relations. President Obama said that his decision to normalize relations came after reaching the conclusion that 50 years of isolation was not bringing any progress. Both he and Cuba's President Raul Castro agreed that engagement would be more productive. Coming up after the break, my exclusive interview with the leader of the Cuban Five, Gerardo Hernandez, following his release from a U.S. prison.
Welcome back to this special edition of America's Now. U.S. President Barack Obama will be visiting Cuba this week. The White House calls it another step forward in promoting positive change for the island nation. The United States imposed a trade embargo in Cuba more than 50 years ago, and despite warming relations, only an act of Congress can lift what the Cubans call the blockade. Michael Voss joins us now in Havana. So, Michael, what exactly have we seen as far as progress, and what more needs to be accomplished?
I think the biggest thing we've seen so far, Elaine, is this agreement by both sides for a resumption of scheduled commercial flights between Cuba and the United States for the first time in 50 years. At the moment, there are charter flights. We could see up to 113 flights a day. The very first ones could start in the next few months. We're also seeing much closer cooperation in a whole range of areas, from environmental protection to counter-narcotics. The two countries are working much closer together in areas of mutual interest. However, despite the hundreds of U.S. business executives who've been to Cuba over the past year, we've seen very little progress in terms of investment and trade. For example, Washington, despite the embargo, approved a number of U.S. companies to start direct ferry services to Cuba. One of them even offered to build a ferry terminal for free here in Havana. So far, the Cubans have not given any response to this. Telecommunications, U.S. telecommunications companies can do business in Cuba. That hasn't happened either. Although, to be honest, Cuba's been very slow and reluctant to approve investment deals, not just with the U.S., but also with Europe and other countries. I think there is a feeling, certainly within the Obama administration, that some big deals do need to come through fairly quickly, because in 12 months' time there could be somebody else in the White House, and it will be much more difficult to roll back progress if there are some big commercial deals or investment going on. What more needs to be done, you asked, Elaine? Certainly from the Cuban side, despite the trade embargo, they want to see President Obama use his executive powers over a couple of areas. One in particular is to allow the US dollar to be used for business with Cuba. At the moment, even if Cuba wanted to pay an American company, they'd have to do it through a third country and in a different currency. It really complicates trade and business in Cuba. That's one easy hit that the Americans could do. And possibly we may see a loosening of the travel restrictions as well, making it easier for more Americans to come to Cuba. The restoration of relations would not have happened if the two sides had not agreed to a prisoner exchange. 3 Cuban spies for the American contractor Alan Gross. The leader of the Cuban spies, intelligence officer Gerardo Hernandez, was serving 2 life sentences plus 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder and espionage, and feared that he might die in a U.S. jail. He's now back in Havana, and I was able to sit down with Gerardo Hernandez late last year. Here's a look at what he had to say in this exclusive interview.
The United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
Hours before U.S. President Barack Obama made his historic joint announcement with Cuba's leader Raul Castro that they'd end their Cold War hostilities, 2 planes took off in opposite directions. It was a prisoner swap, clearing the way to restoring diplomatic relations. One plane carried 3 Cuban intelligence agents who'd spent the past 16 years in jail for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States. The other aircraft carried the U.S. contractor Alan Gross to freedom. He was 5 years into a 15-year sentence for installing internet connections in Cuba outside of the government's control. The Cubans were greeted at the airport by President Raul Castro as national heroes, the last of 5 spies to be released. Then came the emotional encounters with their families. The Cuban government had long fought for their return, claiming the so-called Cuban Five had not been sent to spy on the US, but to infiltrate militant anti-Castro groups in Florida following a terrorist bombing campaign in Havana. Their leader was Gerardo Hernandez, a soldier who'd fought in Angola during the independence wars there and went on to become a senior intelligence officer. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to CCTV. I was offered an exclusive interview which took place in a small meeting room at the Cuban government's International Press Center. There, he told me of his relief at finally coming home.
You feel great, I have to tell you. You feel great. It's been an incredible year, many emotions.
Was it difficult to adapt?
It was difficult, mostly during the first month, because consider that we are not talking about 1 year or 2 years, we are talking about 16 years and 3 months in prison. And prisoners have a code. For example, when you talk to each other, you don't touch, you don't get too close to one another. And then from one day to another, we are in Cuba, surrounded by many people that want to hug you. And it was kind of difficult to adapt.
Gerardo Hernandez and other members of the Cuban Five were arrested in Miami in September 1998, when the FBI broke up a Cuban spy ring known as the WASP network. Gerardo was in charge of the cell. The Cubans infiltrated a group called Brothers to the Rescue, who used light aircraft to help rescue rafters trying to flee Cuba. But they also regularly entered Cuban airspace, flying over Havana, dropping anti-Castro leaflets. In 1996, Cuban MiGs shot down 2 of their planes, killing all 4 on board. The US says it was over international waters. Cuba insists they'd entered its airspace. Gerardo Hernandez was blamed for the attack. You were given 2 life sentences for conspiracy to murder because of the shooting down of the Brothers to Rescue plane and the 4 people who died on that. Was your intelligence responsible for that shooting down?
Absolutely not. What happened is that they needed to blame somebody, and they chose me. I remember the press at the beginning used to say, oh, he sent the flight plan to Cuba. No, the flight plan was sent by the Federal Aviation Administration of the US as a normal procedure. All right, he told Cuba that they would be flying that day. No, Jose Basulto himself, the leader of Brothers to the Rescue, gave a press conference and announced that he would be flying that day.
For years, the Cuban government had fought a major international campaign calling for their release. They featured on May Day parades, and their pictures could be seen across the island. The 5 are household names in Cuba, and their continued incarceration became the focal point of Cuba's antagonistic relationship with Washington. Did you ever think that you would be free, or did you believe you'd die in prison?
It's a complex issue, because on one hand, we hope and we knew that we will be back in Cuba one day.
Solo les digo una cosa, volverán.
We had in 2001 that famous speech where Fidel assured to the Cuban people that we would come back. That was something that we remember every day. But on the other hand, we knew that we were part of a conflict between Cuba and the US that had extended for many years, and the possibility that you would die in prison and never come back to Cuba was real.
Are you bitter towards the United States for the treatment you received there?
Not at all, not at all. I was doing a job, and I knew when I accepted this mission the risks that I was taking. What happened was that we felt in the middle of the long conflict against Cuba and the U.S. And the U.S. saw in us a way of punish Cuba and the Cuban Revolution.
What next for you? There are lots of rumors that some of the five might enter politics. Would you take a position if you were offered one?
I am a soldier, and my main goal in my life, my only plan is to keep serving my country anywhere that somebody or my government consider that I will be useful. But regarding those rumors, I have to tell you, we have been out of the country for many years, and there are people in Cuba that have long careers, even young people that have long careers of politicians, of leaders that are way better prepared than the five to lead the country in any post, provinces, etc.
Spoken like a true politician. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure.
Gerardo Hernandez and all of the Cuban Five were awarded Cuba's highest honor, Heroes of the Cuban Republic. They've also had a very busy schedule traveling all across Cuba and parts of Latin America and Africa to thank people for all their efforts in helping to release them from jail. When we come back, reaction from the Cuban people about the changes on the island. Welcome back to this special edition of America's Now. I'm Michael Voss in Havana. One of the events on President Obama's itinerary this week is to meet with Cuban entrepreneurs and private business owners. It's a bid to strengthen the economic alliance between the two countries and encourage the fledgling private sector here. But what do ordinary Cubans think of President Obama and of this new relationship with the United States? We sent America's Now producer Armando Guerra out to find out.
Nosotros los cubanos nunca esperamos de que fuera una cosa favorable a nuestro país, con muchos intereses que hay en Estados Unidos, con muchos gobiernos que tienen internos. Y en resumida cuenta, nunca esperamos de que ni nos aceptaran, ¿te entiendes?, bajo ninguna condición. Lo que nosotros nos mantenemos en nuestra línea.
No se puede decir se va a levantar el bloqueo y después votar a favor que permanezca el bloqueo. Eso es contradictorio.
me sorprende ni que esté ni que no esté. De todas formas, yo soy una ciudadana en este país de la capa baja, que voy a seguir viviendo igual con bloqueo que sin bloqueo. Ojalá lleguen a una conversación y que todo se resuelva y tengamos prosperidad y unificación, sobre todo que haya amor entre dos países que estamos en pecadito.
Yo creo que es muy bueno, muy satisfactorio que el presidente Obama venga aquí. Y que, como dice, que quiere caminar La Habana, que la camine, para que vea cómo somos nosotros los cubanos.
Me parece que si Obama viene, ya lo dije, debe ser para mejorar la situación del pueblo, que tanto lo necesitamos. Hemos resistido y si tenemos que seguir resistiendo, lo vamos a resistir.
Esta es una fecha maravillosa, muy linda para nosotros los cubanos, ya que llevamos tanto tiempo sin que un presidente americano venga a Cuba. Estoy muy contento.
Como revolucionaria, cubana, estoy contenta, feliz. Quisiera tener la oportunidad de poder verlo en persona, sé que es difícil.
Cuba and the United States both share a passion for baseball. It's one of Cuba's favorite pastimes. During his visit here, President Obama will attend a baseball game between the Cuban national team and a team from the United States, the Tampa Bay Rays. When we return for this special edition of America's Now, Elaine will have an interview from Washington about the U.S. president's agenda in Latin America.
Coming up.
Latin America doesn't rise to the top of the president's to-do list. This is not a region in crisis. This is a region with, macroeconomic stability, rule of law in general. And so it's hard to, when you have crises across the world, to really put Latin America at the front and center of your attention.
But they're its closest neighbors.
America's Now.
Welcome back to this special edition of America's Now. The visit by U.S. President Barack Obama to Cuba is being called history-making. President Obama wants to help drive economic and political reform in the country, yet critics are saying the timing of his trip is a little late, happening in his last year in office. Joining me in our studio to discuss this is Jason Marzak. He is the director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks, Elaine.
Why did President Obama wait so long to visit Cuba? Talk about the timing of this trip.
Well, I don't think it's too long. I think you have to put this in context. The fact that the opening with Cuba started in December of 2014, so it's been 16 months since we had this first opening. The embassy in Cuba opened up last summer, so this ended 50 some odd years of a lack of diplomatic relations. And I think rather than criticizing that this visit is happening too late, some actually are saying this visit is happening too early. I think the visit is happening about the right time. I mean, we've seen about a year and a half almost of the president's actions, not only the actions of December 2014, but multiple additional executive decrees that have helped to booster relations between the two countries. And we've seen some of the benefits of that. We've seen the benefits in Cuba with increased access to Wi-Fi, for example, for the Cuban people that wasn't there before, increased access to remittances from the Cuban private sector. And so there have been some changes. They're small and incremental, but we can't expect large changes to happen very quickly because, again, this is a relationship that was basically on ice for over 50 years.
But he said that he wanted to do something about Cuba when he began office. So here we are 7 years later. Were the political conditions more ripe this time around?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to take this in context, that the President Obama has a lot on his agenda. And the president's attention is, focused on, the Middle East and many other areas of the world. And again, in Cuba, it's also a matter of building confidence with the Cuban government, and also the Cuban government showing the ability to implement some of the reforms that gave the president the momentum to be able to have the opening with Cuba. And again, we have to look at this from the context of Alan Gross as well. Alan Gross had been in a Cuban, the USAID contractor who had been in a Cuban prison for many years. And the ability to negotiate a release for Alan Gross was part of the whole package that allowed for the opening in December 2014. But again, that opening in December 2014 was a year and a half in the making.
But critics in general believe that the Obama administration doesn't really place a priority on Latin America. He's visiting Argentina after his trip to Cuba. So what does he hope to accomplish there?
Well, I think I think again, we have to look at this in the context of everything the president has on his, or potentially her at some point, agenda on a daily basis. And Latin America doesn't rise to the top of the president's to-do list. This is not a region in crisis. This is a region with, macroeconomic stability, rule of law in general. And so it's hard to, when you have crises across the world, to really put Latin America at the front and center of your attention.
But they're his closest neighbors.
They're our closest neighbors. The president has gone. The president was in Panama a year ago for the Summit of the Americas, and not only has he had multiple trips to the region, but so have many members of his cabinet traveled to the region. This is a area of the world that historically has not received as much attention as it should from the administration. But the real thorn in the side of U.S. relations with Latin America has traditionally been our relations with Cuba, and the fact that we didn't have relations with Cuba, and the embargo continues to be a hindrance to that relationship. But by opening up with Cuba and spending the political capital and the investment to open up with Cuba, that has really opened the doors for our broader relationships across the rest of the region. And Argentina specifically, this is a moment of great opportunity. The new government of President Mauricio Macri is only in the course of just the first 100 days unwound a lot of the issues that his predecessor, President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, had with the larger international community. He's rolled back the capital controls, stabilized the foreign exchange rate. And so this is an opportunity to show from the U.S. side support for the government and its new direction.
So very quickly, these trips to Cuba and then to Argentina, do you think that is a more positive step in greater relations with the Latin American region?
I think definitely. Again, the fact that we have a U.S. president going to Cuba, the first time since Calvin Coolidge in 1928, this is a historic moment for U.S. relations with the rest of the region, and also going to Argentina. I mean, Argentina is a bellwether in the region. Argentina is a country that had been ruled with a very nationalist, inward-looking perspective in the last 12 years, and now Argentina has opened the sign of we're welcoming the world, right? And the president's trip there is a signal, and not only his trip there himself, but also his trip with members of the business community that will be traveling with him to Cuba and with him to Argentina is a sign that the U.S. private sector is also interested in investment opportunities in both countries.
Jason Marzak of the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for your perspective.
Great. Thank you, Elaine.
As we mentioned, President Obama will also visit Argentina, and it's not without controversy. It falls on the 40th anniversary of a savage military coup in the country, which installed a dictatorship that led to the murders and disappearances of thousands. For more on the Argentina part of this journey, we go to our correspondent Joel Richards in Buenos Aires.
Well, Barack Obama's visit to Argentina is perhaps not as historic as his visit to Cuba, but just as in Havana, the meetings that take place in Buenos Aires will have a major bearing on the future North-South relations in the Americas. Argentina and the United States have had something of a fractious relationship over the past decade. In 2005, at the Americas Summit held here in Argentina, the late President Néstor Kirchner was an important leader amongst the Latin American presidents, which included Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and Brazil leader Luis Ignacio da Silva, who rejected George W. Bush's free trade agreement. That led to a cooling of diplomatic relationships and also a stagnation of foreign trade between these two countries, with Argentina looking to Russia and in particular to China for its foreign trade partner. This now looks set to change after December's presidential elections, when the Peronist Party, led by the late Néstor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, lost the presidential elections, with Mauricio Macri, the new president, leading a centre-right alliance that looks to reshape the economy and looks to really broaden foreign relations and foreign trade. So it is in this context that President Obama arrives in Argentina, looking to increase trade between the two and also to help Argentina improve its international profile to attract the kind of finance that Mauricio Macri is hoping to bring in to reshape this country's economy. It is that reshaping of the economy that here in Argentina is controversial and being highly debated. But regarding this visit, what's most controversial is the timing. Obama will be conducting an official state visit on the 23rd of March, but the following day is the 40th anniversary of the military coup here in Argentina. The military dictatorship ruled between 1976 and 1983. Tens of thousands of political opponents were persecuted, tortured, killed, and disappeared. It was perhaps the most brutal dictatorship of many military governments here in Latin America. And it's the United States connection which has made this all the more sensitive. The Nobel Prize winner Adolfo Pérez Esquivel has written to Barack Obama, pointing to what he says was the United States' complicity in military rule and questioning the timing of the US president's visit. Nonetheless, Barack Obama will be visiting Argentina, and despite the sensitivities and the controversies, it will nonetheless look to change the relationship between the region's third largest economy, Argentina, and its northern neighbor. Elaine.
Our thanks to Joel Richards in Argentina for that report. Welcome back. One of the things the Cuban people are often associated with is their love of music. Jazz, salsa, rumba are all popular musical genres on the island. Let's bring back Michael Voss in Havana. Michael, how is the Cuban arts and dance community viewing the renewed ties with the United States? As tourism grows, will this mean more exposure?
They're loving it, Elaine. There is just so much music going back and forth at the moment. Just a couple of weeks ago, DJ Diplo and Major Lazer played in front of several 100,000 young Cubans at an open-air concert here in Havana. And in a few days' time, for the slightly older crowd, we have the Rolling Stones giving a live concert. And it's a two-way process. A few years ago, when big-name Cuban salsa bands like Van Van played in Miami, they were faced with demonstrations against them playing there. That's all changed. There are now tours all over the States. And in fact, the Buena Vista Social Club played at the White House not very long ago. And we've seen an incredible interchange of musicians of all sorts. We had a US Symphony Orchestra here. We've had American jazz players come for the Jazz Festival. And we're seeing more and more Cubans being able to travel and perform in the United States. So really, it has made a big difference for the music and cultural scene here.
Michael Voss, thank you for joining us from Cuba. Good to have you with us during this historic week in Havana. Finally, as a new era arrives for Cuba, new music is emerging as well. We thought we'd leave you with these sounds and images of Havana's edgy music scene. Thank you for watching this special edition of America's Now. We'll see you again next week.
Hace muchos años que no hay ningún tipo de sorpresa. Quiere caminar La Habana, que la camine, para que vea cómo somos nosotros los cubanos.
Búscate un trabajo, mijo. Ponte pa' lo tuyo, mijo. Y no juegue con lo mío. No. Y no juegue con lo... Se acabó, se acabó.